All right, let's dive into something fascinating. We're going to look at how one of the world's oldest, and let's face it, most hidden professions can actually be an early warning system for the entire economy. It's a pretty wild lesson in how these huge economic trends, well, they pop up in the most unexpected places, and they can tell us a lot about what might be coming for our own wallets. So let's get right into it. So, it all kicks off with this quote. And look, this isn't some dry analyst's report, right? This is a real person on the ground feeling this sudden, chilling shift in their business. It's that gut feeling that, something is just fundamentally broken. And that's the mystery we're going to try and solve today. Which leads us to the big question, right? Is this person just having a bad month, or are they actually feeling the first tremors of a much larger economic earthquake? That's what we're here to figure out. We're going to dig deep into the economic forces at play and see what's really going on. Okay, first up, let's start by figuring out why this specific industry is such a sensitive economic indicator. I mean, what makes it feel the economic weather change before pretty much anyone else? Well, this brings us to a pretty well-known, if informal concept, the stripper index. Now, insiders and even some economists have talked about this for years. The theory is simple. Because revenue in this industry is so directly tied to people's extra cash, it basically acts like a canary in a coal mine. It starts signaling that there's trouble in the air long before it ever shows up in the official government reports. And the fuel for this whole engine is something called discretionary income. So what is that? It's basically the money you have left over after you've paid for all the boring, essential stuff, rent, groceries, gas. It's your fun money. It's for your wants, not your needs. And services like these, they're funded almost entirely by that fun money, which is exactly why they're one of the very first things to get cut when that money starts to dry up. Okay, so let's look at the first piece of the puzzle, the demand side. Why exactly is that discretionary income just vanishing from the client's wallet? First off, and this is really important, this is not some brand new problem. If you look at this timeline, the real purchasing power for a key demographic here, the median male worker, it's been basically flat for decades. Get this. It was actually lower in 2019 than it was all the way back in 1979. So you've got this long-term squeeze that's already set the stage. The budget is already stretched super thin before the more recent problems even kick in. Okay, now on top of that long-term stagnation, check out the more recent and much sharper pain. Look at what's happened since 2021. Prices for, well, everything shot up about 23%. At the same time, wages only went up about 22%. Now, that little 1% gap might not sound like a big deal, but what it really means is that for most people, any pay raise they got was completely eaten by inflation. They're just running in place. So you might be thinking, well, what about just getting a bigger raise? For years, the best way to do that was to hop to a new job, right? But that job hopping premium, that pay bump you get for switching companies, it's pretty much vanished. Now you add in the constant news about layoffs in major sectors like tech and finance, and what do you get? You get a consumer who is anxious, who is risk-averse, and who is definitely not looking to splash out on luxuries. So the takeaway from all this is pretty simple. The typical client is caught in a vice. On one side, they've got less real money in their pocket. On the other, they've got way more anxiety about the future. And when those two things happen at once, their ability and their willingness to spend on non-essential services, it just takes a massive hit. All right, so now let's flip this around and look at the other side of the market. Because at the exact same time clients are feeling squeezed, providers are facing what you can only call a perfect storm of their own economic pressures. And really, the provider's dilemma is a perfect mirror image of the clients. Their own costs, both for their business and just for living, are skyrocketing. And at the same time, the market has become way more crowded than it's ever been. First, let's just talk about the costs. For a provider who travels for work, their annual hotel bill alone can be over $20,000. That's before you even factor in advertising, travel, or their own rent. So when they have to raise their rates from, say, $400 an hour to $600, it's usually not about trying to get rich. It is a straight-up survival move just to take home the same amount of money at the end of the day. And while their costs are exploding, the market itself is getting absolutely flooded. You have platforms like OnlyFans that dramatically lowered the barrier to entry, which created this huge wave of new competition. Plus, there's a whole universe of cheaper digital alternatives out there that are pulling away the more casual clients. So what's the result? You have more providers than ever, all competing for a shrinking pool of money. So what happens when you bring these two forces together? You have the squeeze client on one side and the pressured provider on the other. Well, you get a market that is heading for a head-on collision. And this is the standoff. It's a classic, totally impossible economic situation. You have providers who are forced to say, look, I have to raise my rates just to cover my own rising costs. And at the exact same time, you have clients saying, I have to cut back on non-essentials just to make ends meet. There's just no middle ground. The market is literally being pulled apart in two opposite directions. And hey, this isn't just a theory. Look at this number. In the few places where we can actually track hard data, think legal brothels and strip clubs, revenues have reportedly dropped by an average of 30%. This standoff has real measurable consequences. The entire market is actually shrinking. And this leads us to the key economic term for what's happening here. It's called demand destruction. This is what happens when prices get so high or people's incomes get squeezed so hard that they don't just buy a little less of something, they stop buying it altogether. They are literally priced out of the market. And the scary part is that demand might not ever come back. Okay, so let's zoom all the way out. We've looked at the client's squeeze, the provider's perfect storm, and the standoff that it creates. But why does what happens in this one niche market matter to the rest of us? It matters because this isn't just some isolated story about one industry. This market is acting like a microcosm. It's a concentrated, high-speed version of what's happening across the entire economy. It's a flashing red warning light for widespread economic instability, where rising costs and flat wages are creating these impossible choices for consumers and businesses pretty much everywhere. So I'll leave you with this final thought. The dynamics we've just walked through, this intense, powerful squeeze on discretionary spending, they don't just stop here. The next time you see a headline about high-end restaurants struggling or boutique travel companies closing down or specialty shops having a hard time, you'll know exactly what's going on. You're just seeing another canary in the economic coal mine.